Welcome everyone to the Green Anti-Capitalist Front Dash Lockdown, a regular live stream series where we talk about the politics of the lockdown, the pandemic, and everything going around. Today we're going to have a very special episode talking with members of Bi Pandas about queer liberation, rainbow capitalism. I'm going to let them talk in just a bit, but before that, remember that the Green Anti-Capitalist Front is a banner under which everyone can organize their own green anti-capitalist actions. So if you are interested in joining, as well as checking your local group, if there's any, you can just create your own or do actions and call it under the CAF banner or whatever you want, as long as you follow our core principles, which you can find in our website, which will be linked under the video you're seeing right now, hopefully, as well as our social media, Facebook, Twitter, other things, Instagram, I think. So yeah, find the links for all of that. With that spam out of the way, I don't want to waste more of your time, and I'm going to introduce you to some lovely people, or more like let them introduce themselves. So if all of you want to introduce yourself and tell us who you are and what are your pronouns.
Yeah, I'll go first. Why not?
Mhm.
My name is Hunter, and I'm one of the co-founders of the London Bi Pandas. If you don't know the London Bi Pandas, we are I keep describing us as a bisexual cult. I think that's the best way to explain it. We sort of emerged out of last year's Pride when we discovered that there wasn't going to be a bi float. So a gaggle of bisexuals got together to build a float, and that just sort of escalated significantly from there. I think we're now reaching about 700 members on our Facebook group, which is obscene. We now have a whole host of different actions that we get involved in, and we're sort of really embracing our very radical and political roots. That's really it.
I can go next. So hi everyone, my name is Vaneet. My pronouns are he, him. I am an Indian bisexual, born and raised in Southall. Um, I work as a software engineer, but on the side I do a lot of stuff in the LGBTQ plus community. So I'm a member of London Bi Pandas. I do a lot of writing, so I've been featured in Metro's website and a few other places, such as a bisexual anthology. I volunteer for Middlesex Pride, Rainbow Films, and I co-founded the AmBIssadors with Lo, who's also on the panel. I'm currently writing a book on bisexual men.
Hi, I'm Lo. My pronouns are they or she. I am the founder of the Bi Survivors Network, which is a network in the UK providing support and advocacy for bi survivors of domestic and sexual violence. I also run the English branch of Be With The Tea. I don't really know how that happened, but I do. I'm an ambassador along with Vaneet. That's a YouTube channel that you can check out. We talk about bi-politics and chat with other activists. And I also have a book about bisexuality, which should be coming out next year. Somehow Vaneet and I both got hired by the same publishers to write about bisexuality, so that's pretty cool.
Cool. Thanks so much, everyone. So this is going to be sort of a panel discussion. So I'm not going to say much myself, other than maybe introduce the topics and questions. And something that we were going to talk first is what are Pride's historical links to radical movements?
So Pride, as most people know, started as a way of commemorating the Stonewall riots, which I think were 5 days of rioting at the Stonewall Inn back in the 60s. And then a year later, a bisexual sex worker called Brenda Howard decided that these should be commemorated. And so she created a march, originally kind of called the March on Washington. She was also a member of the Gay Liberation Front, so they did a lot of work for the original Pride. And the radical roots of Pride are obviously commemorating a riot, a lot of links to sex workers, anti-capitalism, and obviously, as a lot of people know, a lot of the instigators at the Stonewall riots were not only sex workers, but also trans people and people of colour, especially Black women, who have historically been marginalised not only for their queerness, but for their race. And so Pride was very anti-establishment, very much about reclaiming the spaces that we'd been denied from historically.
I think also, like, just to add on that, like, our existence as queer people is political, and it has always been political, and it's never not been political, you know, and to kind of have an already innately radical existence, it just continues to perpetuate that pride should always be connected to its radical roots. We can't step away from its radical roots, and we can't step towards, and I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, towards like all of the sort of rainbow capitalism and pinkwashing and all of these sort of things, because our existence is political. And I think that makes like a really interesting dynamic, which we'll talk about a bit later. But yeah, I just wanted to add that in too.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that we have to remember that the protests were fighting against cops. So when we have, again, getting ahead of ourselves, when you have cops at Pride, it's a little bit like, well, you're already losing the point of how Pride started. And I think it's really important to remember at every point exactly what Pride is about. And whilst it is a part of, you know, people wanting to celebrate themselves and be proud of who they are, it's also about a radical queerness.
Yeah, I think that the kind of shift, we were talking about this earlier, that shift away from it being a protest legally, that shift towards it being a celebration and a parade kind of created this dissonance between what Pride is or was and where it should be, to this commercialized, merchandised version of Pride. And we see that quite a lot in all of the different movements. You know, even in the Black Lives Matter movement, we had somebody message us to ask us if they could sell T-shirts. They were not a Black person, and I was just trying to then educate them around the commercialization of the action that they were taking. Even if you're fundraising for things, this kind of like festivalization, Coachellaization of everything, you know, we're seeing that kind of come through predominantly from very sort of white, middle class, heteronormative communities like XR, who have created this idea around how we protest or how we have a movement that feels very commercial in a way. And I think we can't look at Pride without all of the context of everything else that's happening as well, because movements like XR are sort of coming in and setting this standard, this very white, very middle class, very palatable standard of what a protest should be, really kind of creating that distance away from what radicalism is and making that really unpalatable, which is why I think labels like terrorist and thugs are sort of starting to be like incorrectly aligned with protests.
So maybe you've been talking about this already a bit. So maybe we want to dig a bit more into what is pinkwashing and rainbow capitalism, and why is this an issue?
I think it'd be good to kind of like distinguish between the two as well, because there's like a little bit of difference, I think, between what pinkwashing is and what rainbow capitalism is. Rainbow capitalism is very much concentrated on business and commerce and corporates and brands who are utilizing, I think, the sort of pink pound and again, kind of commercializing Pride. Pinkwashing, on the other hand, you know, it can be part of rainbow capitalism, but there's also like another much more malignant element to it. You know, when we see things like Israel pinkwashing the Eurovision Song Contest as a way of detracting from its other crimes, we see how pinkwashing can be really used by different groups, different organizations, different countries to just weaponize queerness as a way of legitimizing their actions.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where whilst when we talk about rainbow capitalism, it's very much about people trying to cash in on us. Whilst when we talk about pinkwashing, it kind of goes further, and it's not necessarily trying to gain anything money-wise, it's gaining things in other ways. So you see people like police marching down Pride with rainbow colours and trying to align themselves with being an ally, when really it's all really performative, because you then see that hate crimes aren't taken seriously, for example, with the police. You will see people like LGBT plus Tory groups, which, I mean, there's so much to unpack there of like do you hate yourself that much to vote for Tory? So much to unpack there. But it's one of those things where it kind of goes further because they're not gaining money from us. They're not really benefiting in terms of monetarily, but they are benefiting in other ways, and they're trying to make themselves look like allies, but it's all performative, and it's all to look progressive when they're not, and everything internally shows that they're not.
Yeah, it's all cultural capital, right? It's about like being able to increase your status in many ways and draw on all of these different elements of culture, which is kind of this new currency.
Yeah, and I think it links back to what you said in the first question, Hunter, in that our lives are political and our lives are quite radical in that we're going against the cis heteronormative allosexual standard, which is expected of everyone. And so politicians and corporations and brands kind of weaponize, as you said, that radicalness of queerness in order to slap that on whatever they're doing to try and make it look more radical and to hide the regressive and dangerous parts of what they're doing. Which is why it's pinkwashing, because it's just washing over all of the shit with the like aesthetics of our like radical movement.
Since we're talking a lot about the role that corporations take in co-opting pride, and is there, people may wonder if is there anything that large corporation can do to support pride, or is directly no place for capitalist entities in pride?
So I would say, ideally, in an ideal world, corporates wouldn't be involved in pride at all. I don't think there's really a space for them entirely. But unfortunately, we live in this imperfect world where we are under a capitalist agenda, and it's really hard for us to be able to do things without money. And there are ways that you can go about it without getting corporate involvement. You can do crowdfunding, but then when you think about the fact that a lot of people in our community are already suffering, they're in poverty, trying to crowdfund, we're not getting enough money as it is, like that money needs to come from somewhere. And so I think that you do need to end up having corporates in that space, but I think the way that we're involving them is all wrong. I think that if these companies were real allies, they would be happy to decenter themselves, even like give money to the event and then have zero presence, because that would show that they actually just care about the cause and furthering our cause. I actually marched with Pride and STEM in 2019, and we had a corporate company with us, but they took a back seat and everything. So they actually footed the entire bill for Pride and STEM. So for people to march, they actually paid the expenses for students to actually travel up to the Pride as well. But their branding wasn't on our shirts. I don't remember it actually being on our banner. If it was very small. It wasn't mentioned on the little placard. So when the Comp Air was going around, they didn't mention the corporate entity at all. They wore their own shirts and they marched with us, but it was them with us, not the other way around. And I think that if you are going to have corporates at Pride, that's how it needs to be done. They need to not take up space and have a massive giant float being like, look, we're Spotify. That's not how you have corporates at Pride.
Yeah, I think there's like a really interesting tension between queer people who work at corporates, who want to be at Pride, and the corporate itself. And I think there should definitely be a place for people who work at corporates who want to go as individuals. But because of this idea around that, like everything needs to be branded, everything needs to be sponsored, we also like feel this like weird kind of nationalism towards the brands or companies or organizations that we work for, and that we want to represent them. There's all of these kind of different nuances to this context where we might feel like we're trying to like working in a place that doesn't necessarily have a big queer heritage, and for it to then send a corporate pride float can be quite a big deal. For example, somewhere that's notoriously heteronormative, for them to make this political statement and have a float of pride, big deal. Terrible capitalist exploitation, but still kind of a big deal. And I think that's where the tension becomes really muddy for lots of queer people who don't really understand why having brands and having corporations at Pride might be bad, because they're like, well, for some of them, they're making this huge step towards committing to our cause. And for others, it's like, well, I'm getting to represent and having this like say and visibility of being queer within a space where I'm not normally queer. But I don't think there's an easy answer to this one. Apart from that there should be no corporations at Pride in the ideal world, but in the kind of unideal, whatever, the not ideal world that we live in, I think it's around like a little bit around what you're saying is, what are they doing to further our cause? What is the real allyship there? And I think, you know, there's lots of brands that have always supported LGBTQ communities for a really long time. Like, we remember the fucking Absolute Vodka Martini Lounge, whatever it was, in the first season of RuPaul's Drag Race. You know, like, that is a brand that like has always supported LGBTQ communities. Absolute Vodka. I know there's a whole bunch of other kind of nuances around having alcohol brands at Pride and blah blah blah, but like Absolute as a brand was also supplying LGBTQ venues when some other alcohol brands wouldn't, for example. So having brands that have a clear manifesto and history around supporting Pride and around the sort of causes that we have, it does make sense for that corporation to be present at Pride in the sort of unideal world that we're living in, where corporations are allowed at Pride. But also there's around, you know, for a lot of corporations as well, many do lots of activism work, and they're still incredibly, horribly exploitative in other ways. You know, for example, like Apple has done a lot of lobbying within the US around LGBTQ rights legally and has supported change in many different ways, but also are horribly exploitative and capitalist. And it's just about kind of understanding, or not necessarily understanding, but like appreciating the nuance of, you know, these corporations can do everything that they can to be good allies, but if they're still exploiting workers all over the world, how can we like seek liberation for ourselves at the expense of exploitation for others? So even in this like unideal world, we shouldn't have corporations, because that doesn't meet with the ethos of what Pride is about, which is about liberation. And we cannot seek our own liberation while corporations push other people down.
I mean, it's pretty hard to follow that incredible answer. But I just want to like share an anecdote that I, in my day job, I work in marketing and content, and particularly when I used to work in tech, I used to, as like a queer person, a queer individual, be like, oh yeah, I want to, you know, put rainbows everywhere in our Twitter this month because I can and I want to. But as an activist, I would always try and push back against that impulse, because that was like letting the tech brands that I worked on off too easily in order to, you know, look progressive and look like LGBT allies without actually doing anything. So like you said, people, you know, would like to march with their company, and that might be the only way they feel like they can march. And I think that's an important reason that we also push back against corporations, because people shouldn't have to march in Pride, you know, under a banner of Spotify. Wow, Spotify's going to strike this video down. They should be able to just march as queer people who want to march. So, you know, I think it's really important that we separate ourselves from the brands that we often feel like become part of their identity. Like, you often feel like your job becomes part of who you are. In terms of like allyship, I'm with Vaneet and with Hunter, and just give us your money, and don't just give us your money in June or in August or whenever, when you want to sponsor a float. Give us your money all year round, so that we can do the work that we have to do, so that we can, you know, support Bi Survivors and fund trans healthcare and all of these incredible things that grassroots organizations do currently without any corporate sponsorship. Like the float that Sony has at Pride, their budget could fund the Bi Survivors network for like the next 4 years. Give us that money.
I think the other thing as well is, you know, a lot of companies do this stuff, but I always kind of want to know, well, what are you doing internally as well? It's like, yeah, okay, you're outside, and you know, sometimes these companies, they'll be like, oh yeah, we're donating all of this money and stuff, and it's like, okay, that's great, but how are the queer employees feeling in your company? Do they feel respected with their pronouns? Do they feel like they can be out? Like, are you creating safety? Are you talking about well-being, not just well-being in general, but queer well-being? are you addressing all of these issues? Because a lot of the time they aren't, and then they might like call someone in to be on a panel or do something. It's like, well, are you paying those people that you're calling in? You're a corporate entity. You can afford to pay these people, and you can afford to pay them well. So pay them because it will fund the rest of their work.
Yeah, like if you don't have a gender neutral bathroom in your offices, take your Pride float budget and apply it to building a gender neutral bathroom before you even think about coming to Pride.
I think it was last year's Pride where we saw a lot of sponsorship from BAE Systems for local prides, and that was just like an atrocious organization. If you don't know BAE Systems, they provide a lot of like kind of weapon-based systems in there. They build lots of drones that have been used in weaponized, like basically they're arms traders, right? Like as a reductionist view, that's what they are. Although they purport to be many other things, but that's a big core part of who they are. And Surrey Pride, for example, local Surrey Pride was sponsored by BAE Systems. BAE Systems didn't just have a float at Surrey Pride, and I think there was Birmingham Pride as well. Maybe I might be wrong on that one, but there was a couple of smaller prides that were fully sponsored and funded by BAE Systems. There was a lot of understandable outrage from the No War in Pride or No Pride in War campaign, whichever the way around that is, and understandably, yeah, there was a lot of outrage, and the Gay Liberation Front and kind of other sort of community groups got together and really tried to assess what could be done, and they came up with quite like a simple ethical framework around what corporations had to be doing to be able to have a presence at Pride, for us to even be able to accept that money, because ultimately, like, if we're taking money from Pride that has been used as a result of the exploitation of a number of different organizations or groups or entire nations, then actually is that still pinkwashing? And I think it is. It's absolutely still pinkwashing, and I think that's where it becomes like quite interesting, especially because the current fund for Pride in London, they've just set up a new sort of financial scheme where registered charities and like organizations can access funding, but that funding is also co-sponsored by Facebook, and then it just sort of brings in all of these kind of ethics to where is that money coming from, and are we okay accepting it? You know, like look at Facebook today deciding to donate to the Republican Party. You know, that is absolutely like, if you're accepting money from Facebook, you're kind of saying I accept that that action is okay enough for me to accept that money, and that action should never be okay enough. That's my opinion.
Also, side note on that new fund that Pride in London has brought in that both the groups we represent, the Bi Survivors Network and Pandas, we're not registered charities, corporations, whatever. We raise money by asking already, marginalized queer people to help us support other marginalized queer people. And I think that's how a lot of like grassroots organizations run. So even the fund that they've put together to help decorporatize London Pride going forward still has these barriers that like a lot of queer groups just can't access. How are you expecting queer migrant groups to register as a charity with the Tory government?
I thought that was really weird for them to say, we want to support grassroots, and then they said charities. And I'm like, those aren't the same thing.
For sure.
And I think there's also something to be said about like actual like numbers.
Mm-hmm.
There are only certain amounts of spaces at Pride for people to march through, and we keep giving them to corporations and not actually groups that support our communities and the most marginalized of our communities. So I don't know if anybody remembers when the Outside Project and LGS Migrants tried to join the Pride Parade last year, and they were stopped by the police. And I was like, how fucking dare you allow Disney and Sony and BAE Systems and the fucking army and the Tory government through, and not the people who are helping homeless queers and migrant queer people? And what the actual fucking fuck is that about?
I think it was the year before that, they were told that they were not allowed to march in Pride because of the fact that they didn't have like an aesthetically pleasing float. And I think they've now gone back on that, and I think they've somewhat apologized to the outside project for that. But at the time, that's what they were told, that firstly they had to raise the funds, and when they raised the funds, they were like, it's not aesthetically good looking, like what you've got. It's like, well, no, it's a bus that we use to house the homeless people. Like, are you kidding? Like, this isn't, what the hell is this?
There's like the added costs of actually participating in Pride itself because of that requirement. Like, we had to raise nearly like £3,000 or £4,000 last year, which is an obscene amount of money to be able to participate in a Pride parade. That was ridiculous. We had to hire a truck, or whatever it's called, a flatbed truck. We had to find a place to store it, build our float around it, buy all the materials for it, and just, it was kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, when we did the first Bi Pride float project in 2017, because there'd never been a Bi Pride float in all of London Pride's like 47-year history, and they had space for Disney, Sony, Spotify, but hadn't stopped to think about whether or not they should have any bi groups. We again had to raise, I think we ended up raising like $4,000. And talking about aesthetically pleasing, we were like still nailing it together on the Pride showgrounds whilst we were waiting for the Pride to kick off.
Yeah. Just like the minimal accessibility requirement for participating in Pride, the financial accessibility requirement is a £200 or £300 application fee.
Yeah.
For small grassroots groups, why the hell would you spend that much money when you could use that to actively help and benefit people in your community?
Yeah, there's a conversation that BSN, the Bi Survivors Network, started having earlier this year, because we were planning on having, we were going to table it. And, and tabling at Pride is quite an important thing to do, because it's a great way of raising awareness, of reaching out to Bi survivors who might not know we exist. But for a table in London Pride, it's something like £300. And we had to have a conversation about, do we use that? That's like minimum. That's just to get in. That's not the table, the leaflets, the traveling volunteers there, the stuff for the day. Do we use that money for one day, or do we raise £500, £600 and put it towards a hardship fund or whatever else? So even the entrance of £300, and luckily we didn't have to make that decision this year. We can put it off for another year. But again, even getting in is so expensive.
Yeah, and it's also like, I think the kind of, from an ethical perspective of me as an individual, and this is not me as London Bi Pandas, the desire to participate in this commercialized Pride. Like last year, I think it felt really urgent to participate in like as a float, because there was no bi float happening. So that kind of decision was made for us. But this year, it feels very much like, why would I want to continue supporting this when there are all of these other Pride events that are happening, that are run by, for example, queer people of colour, that I would much rather go and support. For example, I would rather have a table at UK Black Pride as a person of colour than in Pride in London. So actually, what else exists out there that is more community focused? Because London Pride itself, the big London Pride, does not feel like a community event.
Something that you mentioned, Lo, which was really important, is that, so my first Pride that I ever went to, where I wasn't fully out, was 2017. And that was also the year that they said there was no bi float. And it was like everywhere. And I was like, oh, I guess I just don't exist. That's great. And then it wasn't until you started up that project and you then had the float in 2018 that actually created that visibility. And I think that that's a really difficult thing that, I think I was going to mention this later, and I'll mention it now. I was like, it's a really difficult thing of, do we keep supporting this event when it's so corporate focused and not community focused? We could pull out, but the problem is that when we pull out, it then becomes more of a party and more of a celebratory event, and that visibility then gets lost. And then that lack of visibility can then harm people, because imagine being at your first Pride and you don't see any bi people and you don't see any bi flags because they've all decided to pull out, and all you have is Kylie Minogue on the stage. Like, it just doesn't fit. And so you get stuck in this middle ground of wanting to be there to create that visibility, but not really wanting to support this event because it's not for you.
Yeah, I think I always say that the London Bi Pandas are an anti-capitalist group living in a capitalist world. So we're forced to make decisions that we don't want to make. Every time I think about it, as much as I like, oh my God, my ethics, my principles, and blah, 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 I remember like people in the crowd screaming when they saw our float with like guillotine the bankers in the front and like ACAB posters and decriminal like posters and people like losing their fucking mind. And I was like, this is so important what we just did. Like the vast majority of this like predominantly like white middle like fairly, I assume, heteronormative like voyeuristic audience did not get it, but those like especially like young people really got it. And I'm like, okay, that's who we're here for. And I think that it's really important not to like lose sight of it, because sometimes you can also be like really bogged down in like the ethics and the principles of it all, of like, oh, what does this mean, and maybe I shouldn't take this money, and maybe I shouldn't do this. And actually, like, for that person to raise their fist and lose their mind screaming when they saw our float, like, I think it's worth it. Probably.
I mean, I would just say on a personal level, like I saw the sort of fundraising go around for London Bi Pandas and the float, and obviously I was already marching with a different group, but then when I saw your pictures afterwards online, I lost my shit. And I was like, this is incredible. I don't know who this group is, but I stand, I'm following. I need to know who this group is, and I need to be part of it.
Yeah, we were only able to have the Be of the Tea marching group last year because Pride in London organised that without us having to pay anything as an apology for their fuck up the year before. And so again, you know, we were able to provide that visibility of solidarity between bi and trans communities, and for bi trans people who are so often erased in like queer spaces, because we didn't have to pay for it, and that's something we wouldn't have been able to provide like otherwise.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about London Pride is when it comes to like paying for places, there are some free activist community group spaces, but they're really limited. Whereas, and I think that's the flaw there. I think we should have like an unlimited amount of community activist groups, and then whatever is left over can be sold off to whatever fucking corporate wants it. I think that's the best way to do it, to ensure that this is a community event for queer people in London. It isn't a massive kind of drive for straight women to come and gulp at people. Like the amount of like horror stories that I've heard from trans people, for example, being misgendered, for like homophobic abuse to happen by like celebrants, like straight celebrants at Pride, is ridiculous. And that's because of this Coachella-ization of Pride.
Yeah, the first time I ever got called a dyke was by someone who was pissing against a skip during Pride in Brighton. And on that day, I just vowed to never let myself be offended by anyone who was pissing against a skip while yelling at me.
And I think that goes back to the thing that I started with is, you know, there shouldn't be a limited number of free spaces for community and activist groups. It should be unlimited, and it should be the corporates footing that bill. It shouldn't be down to small little organizations who have a handful of members trying to scrape together a couple of £100 just for an application, let alone the rest of it for the float. And you fund all that money for the application and you may even be denied. So like, it's ridiculous. The corporates should be footing that bill. If they are actual allies, they actually care, that's where that money should be going.